The salt-laden wind off the English Channel screamed through the narrow stone battlements of Dover Castle on a bitter morning in the late autumn of 1216, but the chill inside the royal chambers had nothing to do with the weather. King John, the monarch whose volatile temper and disastrous misrule had pushed his own barons into open, treasonous rebellion, stood before a massive oak table, his fingers digging into a map of his fracturing kingdom. For months, his subjects had traded whispers of an impending apocalypse, a rumor that the crown of England was about to be forcibly torn from the Plantagenet line. The whispers were no longer mere gossip. They had materialized into a terrifying reality just a few miles across the water, where a massive invasion fleet was assembling under the banner of the French Capetian dynasty. Yet as John stared at the coastline where his reign would either be salvaged or permanently extinguished, a catastrophic blow was already landing not from the sea, but from the treacherous mud of a tidal estuary known as the Wash. There, in the freezing mist of a Lincolnshire afternoon, a baggage train stretching over a mile long, carrying the crown jewels, ancient relics, and the literal solvency of the English monarchy, was beginning to sink into the shifting sands. The disaster at the Wash was not a sudden, unpredictable freak of nature, but the culmination of a decade of systematic tyranny, paranoia, and political desperation that had broken the fragile contract between the English king and his nobility. John had spent his entire reign living in the long, suffocating shadow of his brother, Richard the Lionheart, whose military exploits had made him a legend even as they left the royal treasury utterly bankrupt. When John ascended the throne in 1199, he inherited a kingdom stretched to its financial limits and a continental empire that was rapidly disintegrating under the brilliant, predatory maneuvering of King Philip II of France. Driven by a desperate need to fund his overseas military campaigns and reclaim his lost lands in Normandy, John turned England into a predatory fiscal state, utilizing every legal loophole, exorbitant tax, and arbitrary feudal fine at his disposal to squeeze wealth from his barons. The anger had simmered for 16 years, a slow-burning fuse that finally ignited in the damp water meadows of Runnymede in June of 1615, when the desperate barons forced John to attach his Great Seal to a document that would become known as Magna Carta. But the Great Charter was never a peace treaty. It was merely a temporary ceasefire in a war that both sides knew was inevitable, and as John secretly petitioned Pope Innocent III to annul the document, the barons realized that the only way to save England from their king was to replace him entirely.
The baronial faction, realizing that John would never willingly abide by any constitutional limits on his power, took a step that would have been unthinkable just a generation prior. They offered the crown of England to Prince Louis, the eldest son and heir of their greatest enemy, King Philip of France. Louis was no stranger to the complex web of European dynastic politics, and through his marriage to Blanche of Castile, the granddaughter of Henry II, he possessed a tenuous but serviceable claim to the English throne. For the rebellious barons, Louis represented stability, military competence, and, most importantly, the backing of the formidable French military machine. In the spring of 1216, despite the furious denunciation of the Pope, who excommunicated the French prince for daring to attack a papal vassal, Louis gathered a massive army of knights, crossbowmen, and mercenary siege engineers along the coast of Artois. The French fleet, numbering hundreds of ships, set sail across the narrow channel, their sails filling the horizon like an incoming tide of iron and silk. When Louis landed at Sandwich in May, John's mercenary army, largely composed of continental soldiers whose loyalty shifted with the wind, refused to fight the French prince, forcing the English king into a humiliating fighting retreat toward the west, leaving London and the wealthy southeast to fall into the hands of the invaders. By the late summer of 1216, England was a land divided by two kings and ravaged by an unconventional war of attrition, where castles were besieged for months and the countryside was systematically put to the torch. Prince Louis held London, where the rebellious barons swore fealty to him in St. Paul's Cathedral, while King John maintained a string of powerful royal fortresses in the Midlands and the West Country, including the formidable strongholds of Windsor, Wallingford, and Corfe Castle. John, knowing he could not defeat Louis in a traditional pitched battle, adopted a brutal scorched earth strategy, moving his army with astonishing speed across the landscape, burning the estates of his rebellious subjects and extracting massive protection ransoms from towns and monasteries alike. It was a campaign born of deep desperation and growing mental instability. The king was sleeping in full armor, constantly changing his itinerary at the last minute out of fear of assassination, and tracking his mounting losses on sheets of stained vellum. In October, determined to break the back of the rebellion in the north and east, John marched his army into Lincolnshire, a region of treacherous marshes, deep fens, and wealthy monastic houses that had long supported the baronial cause. The king's immediate destination was the prosperous port town of Lynn, now known as King's Lynn, a vital trading hub located on the eastern edge of the great estuary known as the Wash. Lynn had remained loyal to John, largely because the king had granted the town an exceptionally generous royal charter that freed its merchants from the oppressive jurisdiction of the local bishop. On October 9th, John and his royal retinue rode into the town to an ecstatic welcome from the local populace, who viewed the king as their protector against the predatory regional barons. For 2 days, John indulged in the lavish hospitality of the town's wealthy merchant elite, drowning his anxieties in massive quantities of rich food and heavy imported wines. Contemporary chroniclers, such as the monk Matthew Paris, would later note with a mix of moral condemnation and grim satisfaction that the king gorged himself on fresh peaches and raw, unfermented cider, which in the medical understanding of the time was considered an absolute recipe for a fatal imbalance of bodily humors. While John feasted within the safety of Lynn's wooden palisades, his military commanders and royal clerks were growing increasingly anxious about the movement of the rebel forces. Reports reached the royal camp that a powerful baronial army was marching south from Yorkshire, intending to trap the king against the coast and cut him off toward his strongholds in the west. John knew he had to move, and he had to move immediately, but his army was heavily encumbered by a massive baggage train that carried the accumulated wealth of his entire reign. This train was not merely a collection of supply wagons, it was the mobile heart of the English state, containing the portable royal treasury, hundreds of silver pennies to pay the foreign mercenaries, secret diplomatic correspondence, holy relics collected by the king's ancestors, and the irreplaceable regalia of the Anglo-Saxon and Norman kings, including the great golden crown worn by William the Conqueror. To move this immense, slow-moving column along the established overland roads around the deep indent of the Wash would take days, days that John's scouts warned he simply did not have before the rebel forces closed the trap. On October 12th, John made a fateful, reckless decision that would alter the course of English history forever. Rather than taking the long, safe route inland through Wisbech, John decided to split his forces. He would take his mounted knights and light vanguard and ride along the edge of the fens, while the cumbersome baggage train, escorted by a smaller guard of infantry and local guides, would take a dangerous but much shorter route directly across the estuary of the Wash. At low tide, the Wash transformed from a vast shallow sea into an immense expanse of wet sand, mudflats and salt marshes, intersected by deep, meandering river channels like the Welland and the Nain. Local guides had traveled these paths for centuries, knowing the precise hours when the sand was firm enough to support weight, but it was an environment of extreme peril, where a single misstep could lead into deep, liquefying quicksand, and where the incoming tide did not merely roll over the beach, but rushed inward with terrifying speed, a bore of water that could outrun a galloping horse. The baggage train set out from the eastern shore near Cross Keys just as the dawn light began to silver the damp mud. The column was an extraordinary spectacle of medieval logistics. Dozens of heavy, iron-tired wooden wagons drawn by teams of oxen and heavy cart horses, pack mules laden with leather panners, royal clerks riding small palfreys, and a desperate rabble of camp staff, kitchen staff, laundresses and blacksmiths, all struggling to keep pace. The air was thick with the smell of wet salt, animal sweat, and the sharp, pungent mud of the flats. In the center of the column rode the heavily guarded treasury wagons, their thick oak timbers reinforced with iron bands and secured with massive padlocks, containing the accumulated treasure that John had ruthlessly stripped from the churches and barons of England over nearly 2 decades of rule. Which took place on October 28, 1216, at the Abbey of St. Peter in Gloucester, was perhaps the most improvised and austere royal investiture in English history. Because London was still held by Prince Louis and the rebel barons, the traditional venue of Westminster Abbey was completely unavailable, and because the ancient royal regalia had been lost in the mud of the Wash just 2 weeks prior, there was no crown to be placed upon the young boy's head. In a makeshift ceremony arranged by William Marshal and the papal legate Guala Bicchieri, a simple golden corselet or plain gold band belonging to the boy's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, was used as a substitute crown. The young king, dressed in oversized royal robes that had to be hastily pinned up by the court tailors, swore the traditional coronation oaths before a small, grim-faced gathering of loyalists, his voice high and clear in the chilly Abbey church. Immediately after the coronation, William Marshal, now officially appointed as the Regent of England and Protector of the realm, issued a masterstroke of political reconciliation that would ultimately save the Plantagenet dynasty. In the name of the young King Henry, Marshal reissued Magna Carta,
the very document that King John had died fighting to destroy. By stripping the charter of its most radical anti-royal clauses, such as the council of 25 barons who could legally wage war on the king, Marshal transformed it from a weapon of rebellion into a symbol of royal justice and good governance. This brilliant concession took the wind entirely out of the rebel sails. It offered the barons exactly what they had originally wanted, legal protection under the law, without the necessity of subverting the English crown to a foreign prince. As the winter of 1216 turned into the spring of 1217, the political tide began to turn decisively against Prince Louis. Letters traveled secretly across the country as William Marshal systematically reached out to individual rebel barons, offering full royal pardons and the restoration of their lands if they would abandon the French prince and swear fealty to the young Henry III. One by one, major English nobles began to defect back to the royalist camp, realizing that Louis was increasingly favoring his own French captains and treating England as a conquered territory rather than a sovereign kingdom. Louis, sensing his grip slipping, launched a series of aggressive military campaigns to secure his positions, culminating in a twin-pronged assault on the vital royal strongholds of Dover in the south and Lincoln in the east.
On the night of October 18, 1216, as a fierce storm battered the stone towers of Newark, King John dictated his final will and testament. In a room lit only by the guttering wax tapers, the king committed his soul to God and St. Wulfstan, and appointed a council of 13 loyal executors, led by William Marshal, to govern the realm and protect his eldest son and heir, Henry, who was just 9 years old. Shortly after midnight, as the wind howled outside, the tempestuous, brilliant, and deeply flawed King of England drew his last breath. The response of his servants was immediate and grimly characteristic of the era. No sooner had the king's heart stopped than his attendants fell upon his personal belongings, looting the chamber of its silver plate, expensive silks, and even the royal bed linens, leaving the naked, cold body of the monarch abandoned on the mattress until the priests arrived to prepare it for burial. The death of King John sent a massive shock-wave through the fractured political landscape of England, completely upending the calculations of both the rebellious barons and the invading French army. For nearly 2 years, the unifying force behind the Civil War had been a collective, consuming hatred of John's tyranny. With the old king dead, the primary justification for the rebellion vanished overnight. Prince Louis suddenly found himself in a radically changed position. He was no longer a liberator saving England from a tyrant, but a foreign invader attempting to steal the birthright of an innocent 9-year-old English boy. William Marshal, recognizing this psychological shift with the instinct of a master statesman, moved with incredible speed to exploit the situation, summoning the remaining loyal bishops and barons to Gloucester for the immediate coronation of young Henry III.
Which took place on October 28, 1216, at the Abbey of St. Peter in Gloucester, was perhaps the most improvised and austere royal investiture in English history. Because London was still held by Prince Louis and the rebel barons, the traditional venue of Westminster Abbey was completely unavailable, and because the ancient royal regalia had been lost in the mud of the Wash just 2 weeks prior, There was no crown to be placed upon the young boy's head. In a makeshift ceremony arranged by William Marshal and the papal legate Guala Bicchieri, a simple golden corselet or plain gold band belonging to the boy's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, was used as a substitute crown. The young king, dressed in oversized royal robes that had to be hastily pinned up by the court tailors, swore the traditional coronation oaths before a small, grim-faced gathering of loyalists, his voice high and clear in the chilly abbey church. Immediately after the coronation, William Marshal, now officially appointed as the Regent of England and Protector of the realm, issued a masterstroke of political reconciliation that would ultimately save the Plantagenet dynasty. In the name of the young King Henry, Marshal reissued Magna Carta, the very document that King John had died fighting to destroy. By stripping the charter of its most radical anti-royal clauses, such as the council of 25 barons who could legally wage war on the king, Marshal transformed it from a weapon of rebellion into a symbol of royal justice and good governance. This brilliant concession took the wind entirely out of the rebel sails. It offered the barons exactly what they had originally wanted, legal protection under the law, without the necessity of subverting the English crown to a foreign prince. As the winter of 1216 turned into the spring of 1217, the political tide began to turn decisively against Prince Louis. Letters traveled secretly across the country as William Marshal systematically reached out to individual rebel barons, offering full royal pardons and the restoration of their lands if they would abandon the French prince and swear fealty to the young Henry III. One by one, major English nobles began to defect back to the royalist camp, realizing that Louis was increasingly favoring his own French captains and treating England as a conquered territory rather than a sovereign kingdom. Louis, sensing his grip slipping, launched a series of aggressive military campaigns to secure his positions, culminating in a twin-pronged assault on the vital royal strongholds of Dover in the south and Lincoln in the east.
The fleeing rebels encountered a bizarre and fatal obstacle at the Wigford Gate at the bottom of the hill. The gate had been fitted with a heavy wooden bar that closed automatically from the outside whenever a carriage or horse pressed against it too quickly. As hundreds of panicked knights and infantry tried to squeeze through the narrow opening, the gate slammed shut, trapping the rear guard in a tight bottleneck where they were systematically cut down or captured by Marshal's pursuing knights. The victory was total. Over 300 rebel knights were captured, including the primary leaders of the baronial faction, effectively ending the land campaign of Prince Louis in England in a single bloody afternoon. Despite the spectacular success at Lincoln, the war was not yet completely won. Prince Louis still held London with a powerful garrison, and his formidable wife, Blanche of Castile, was busy assembling a massive reinforcement fleet on the coast of Picardy. Blanche, a woman of extraordinary political acumen and energy, had mortgaged her own lands to hire mercenaries and equip a massive fleet of over 80 large transport ships and cog vessels, packed with fresh knights, infantry, and vital supplies. To command this crucial armada, she turned to one of the most notorious and terrifying figures of the medieval world, Eustace the monk.
Eustace was a former Benedictine monk who had abandoned his monastery to become a ruthless pirate, mercenary, and alleged practitioner of black magic, whose fleet had terrorized the English Channel for over a decade, serving whichever monarch paid him the most silver. In August 1217, Eustace's great fleet set sail from Calais, heading directly for the mouth of the River Thames with the intention of relieving Prince Louis in London. When news of this massive naval threat reached the royalist court, William Marshal rushed to the port town of Sandwich in Kent to organize a naval countermeasure. The English treasury was empty, and Marshal could only assemble an improvised fleet of roughly 40 ships, mostly converted cog vessels and small fishing boats provided by the loyalty of the Cinque Ports. The English sailors, knowing the terrifying reputation of Eustace the monk, were initially paralyzed by fear. But Marshal, standing on the harbor docks, shamed them into action, declaring that he would gladly die with them if it meant saving England from French domination. The Battle of Sandwich, fought on August 24, 1217, was one of the most innovative and brutal naval engagements in the history of medieval warfare. The English fleet, under the tactical command of Hubert de Burgh, the Justiciar of England, adopted a highly unusual strategy. Rather than sailing directly at the larger French ships, they allowed Eustace's fleet to pass them, using their superior knowledge of the local winds to gain the weather gauge, positioning themselves directly upwind of the enemy. Once they had secured this crucial advantage, the English ships turned and bore down on the French armada from behind, their sails full of wind and their wooden bows cutting through the waves with lethal speed. As the English cogs closed the distance, they unleashed a terrifying secret weapon that caught the French completely off guard. English sailors stood on the high forecastles of their ships, holding large linen sacks filled with finely powdered quicklime. As they drew alongside the French vessels, they threw the powder into the air, allowing the strong channel wind to carry it directly into the faces of the enemy knights and sailors. The quicklime, reacting instantly with the moisture in the men's eyes and lungs, caused immediate agonizing blindness and suffocation. Blinded, coughing, and screaming in agony, the French knights could not defend their decks as the English sailors launched heavy iron grappling hooks, pulling the ships together and boarding them with axes, daggers, and short swords.
The boarding action turned into a systematic slaughter. The unarmored English sailors, wearing only simple wool tunics and leather caps, were far more agile on the wet, tilting wooden decks than the heavily armored French knights, who struggled to maintain their footing on planks that were slick with blood and quicklime. English boarding parties moved through the French ships like a reaping scythe, cutting the rigging to immobilize the vessels and hacking at the exposed limbs of the enemy nobles. Eustace's flagship, the largest and most heavily defended vessel in the fleet, was eventually surrounded and overwhelmed by 3 English cogs, its defenders systematically killed or thrown overboard into the cold, churning waters of the Channel. Eustace the monk was found hiding in the deep recesses of the ship's hold, wrapped in a soiled sailcloth. He was dragged up onto the open deck by his hair and thrown before the English commanders. Eustace offered an immense ransom of gold to save his life and promised to serve the English king faithfully for the rest of his days, but the sailors of the Cinque Ports, who had suffered for years from his pirate raids, refused to hear his pleas.
A knight named Richard, an illegitimate son of King John, stepped forward with a heavy broadsword. With a single, powerful blow, he severed the pirate's head from his shoulders on the ship's gunwale, ending the career of the most feared mariner in Europe. The double catastrophe at Lincoln and Sandwich completely shattered Prince Louis's ambitions in England. With his land forces captured, his reinforcement fleet destroyed, and his supplies cut off, the Prince Louis realized that his position in London was no longer a beachhead for a conquest, but a trap that was rapidly closing around him. In September 1217, Louis signed the Treaty of Lambeth, officially renouncing his claim to the English crown in exchange for a large financial payment of 10,000 marks, a sum disguised as a gift to cover his expenses, but in reality a bribe to get him to leave the country immediately. Within weeks, the French prince and his remaining knights boarded their ships and sailed back to France, leaving England to heal from the deep, self-inflicted wounds of its first great constitutional crisis. The England that emerged from the crucible of the First Barons' War was a fundamentally transformed nation, and the architect of its resurrection was the aging William Marshal. Until his death in May 1219, Marshal governed the country with a rare combination of legal scrupulousness and political moderation, ensuring that the young Henry III was raised to respect the legal limits established by Magna Carta. The Charter itself, which began as a desperate piece of political bartering by a tyrant king, was now firmly established as the foundational cornerstone of English common law, a document that legally bound the monarch to the will of the community of the realm, setting a precedent that would eventually shape the development of constitutional democracy across the Western world. But as the decades rolled by and Henry III grew into his long, troubled reign, the physical memory of the old king's disaster continued to haunt the imagination of the English people. The Wash, that immense and shifting landscape of sand and tide, refused to yield its secrets. For centuries, local fishermen and marsh dwellers told tales of strange metallic glints deep within the mud at exceptionally low tides, and of the ghosts of John's baggage drivers whose cries could still be heard mingling with the calls of the curlews on stormy autumn nights. The lost treasure of King John became one of the greatest and most tantalizing mysteries of European history. A literal fortune in gold, silver, and ancient royal regalia, buried somewhere beneath the vast, reclaimed agricultural fields of Lincolnshire. To understand how this catastrophic event could have occurred, one must look back at the very nature of medieval kingship and the unique geographical challenges of the English landscape in the early 12th century. In an era before paved highways and modern drainage, the fenlands of eastern England were a vast, untamed wilderness of water and reeds, a labyrinth where the line between land and sea was constantly shifting. King John, a man characterized by contemporary chroniclers as having the speed and unpredictable nature of a striking serpent, had long relied on his ability to move his court and army through these difficult terrains faster than his enemies thought possible, using mobility as a substitute for political consensus. The royal treasury itself was not a fixed bank vault, but a highly mobile, complex administrative apparatus known as the wardrobe. Wherever the king rode, the wardrobe followed, packed in heavy leather-covered chests and loaded on sturdy carts drawn by teams of selected oxen. It contained not only the daily operational currency of the state, thousands of silver pennies minted with the king's profile, but also the physical manifestations of royal majesty, Jewel-encrusted swords, golden chalices used for royal chapels, fine silk robes embroidered with gold thread, and the irreplaceable state records and charters that documented the land holdings and debts of every noble family in the realm. To lose the wardrobe was to lose the administrative and financial memory of the kingdom. Among the lost treasures was the grand crown of the realm, a magnificent piece of goldsmithing that had been passed down through generations of Norman monarchs since the time of William the Conqueror. This crown was not merely a decorative ornament, it was a sacred object, anointed with holy oil during the coronation ritual, representing the literal soul of the state and the divine sanction of the king's rule. For an age deeply attuned to religious symbolism and divine providence, the sudden violent swallowing of this sacred crown by the mud of the Wash was seen as nothing less than a direct, thunderous judgment from God himself, a cosmic condemnation of John's tyrannical behavior and his breaking of his sacred oaths.
The architectural legacy of this dramatic era can still be traced across the landscape of modern England, where the stout stone fortresses that witnessed the conflict still stand as silent monuments to the struggle. Newark Castle, though partially slighted during the English Civil War centuries later, still rears its massive stone curtain wall over the River Trent, the dark windows of its residential quarters marking the very rooms where King John spent his final agonizing hours listening to the rain. In Lincoln, the great castle walls still face the magnificent towers of the cathedral across the historic cobblestone square, a physical space that once ran red with the blood of French knights during the decisive battle that saved the Plantagenet line. In the centuries following the disaster, numerous attempts were made by antiquarians, treasure hunters, and modern archaeologists to locate the precise site of the baggage train's destruction. But the unique geology of the Wash has rendered all such efforts utterly futile. Over the last 800 years, the shifting currents of the estuary, combined with massive, systematic land reclamation projects undertaken by Dutch engineers in the 17th century, have completely altered the coastline of Lincolnshire. What was once an open, treacherous bay of salt water and quicksand is now a prosperous landscape of rich, dark agricultural soil, covered in fields of wheat, potatoes, and sugar beets, hiding the golden secrets of the medieval monarchy beneath several meters of ancient silt. The human cost of the conflict was immense, leaving an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the 13th century generation. For nearly 3 years, fields went untilled, villages were burned by marauding mercenaries, and families were torn apart by conflicting loyalties to the Crown and the Charter. Chroniclers of the period write with palpable horror of the conduct of John's foreign mercenary captains, such as Fawkes de Breauty and Loupscar, who treated the English countryside as a conquered territory, extracting wealth through torture and terror, showing no respect for the sanctuary of churches or the innocence of monastic houses. Yet out of this profound suffering, the basic structures of modern constitutional law began to crystallize. When Henry III reached his majority in 1225, he voluntarily reissued Magna Carta once again, this time in exchange for a massive tax grant from his barons and people. This crucial moment permanently established the fundamental principle that would guide the evolution of Anglo-American law, that the king could not levy taxes or alter the laws of the land without the explicit consent of the governed, a principle that would echo through the centuries, eventually finding its way into the founding documents of the American Republic over 500 years later. 2. The personality of King John himself remains one of the most intensely debated subjects among historians of the medieval era. Was he the unmitigated, psychotic villain of popular folklore, the cruel Prince John of the Robin Hood legends? Or was he a highly capable, hard-working administrator who simply was overwhelmed by the impossible geopolitical challenges of his time? The historical record suggests a deeply contradictory figure, a king who possessed a brilliant, analytical mind and an unmatched capacity for administrative detail, who spent hours personally reviewing legal documents and court records, yet who lacked the basic human empathy, diplomatic tact, and emotional stability required to manage the proud, touchy Anglo-Norman aristocracy. John's paranoia, which grew steadily throughout his reign, was his ultimate undoing. He was a monarch who could never bring himself to fully trust anyone, constantly demanding the children of his barons as hostages to ensure their father's loyalty, and driving his closest friends into rebellion through arbitrary acts of cruelty. The most notorious example of the dark nature of King John was the fate of his young nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who possessed a rival claim to the English throne. In 1203, Arthur vanished mysteriously while being held in John's custody at the castle of Rouen, with contemporary whispers suggesting that the king personally murdered the boy in a drunken fury and thrown his weighted body into the Seine. In stark contrast to the dark reputation of King John stands the legendary figure of William Marshal, the man whose unyielding loyalty and military brilliance saved the kingdom from the brink of total destruction. Marshal's life was an extraordinary romance of chivalry and survival. Born the younger son of a minor noble, he had risen through the ranks of the royal court through his sheer prowess on the tournament fields of France, where he was said to have unhorsed over 500 knights in single combat. By the time of John's death, Marshal had served Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John himself, earning a reputation throughout Europe as the literal embodiment of knightly honor and fidelity, a man whose word was absolute bond. When Marshal accepted the regency of the young Henry III at Newark Castle, he did so with a full understanding of the immense, nearly suicidal burden he was taking on. The kingdom was bankrupt, the capital was held by an invading French army, and the majority of the nobility were in open rebellion. Yet at the age when most of his contemporaries had been buried in church crypts for decades, the old knight buckled on his armor once more, riding across the country to rally the despondent royalist forces, and using his immense personal prestige to convince the skeptical barons that the young king deserved a chance to rule justly under the law. The strategic importance of the city of Lincoln during this conflict cannot be overstated, as it sat at the crucial crossroads of England's ancient Roman road network. The city was divided into two distinct zones: the lower town, which stretched along the banks of the River Witham and was largely populated by wealthy wool merchants and tradesmen, and the upper town, a massive stone citadel perched atop a steep, precipitous limestone ridge that dominated the surrounding flat countryside for miles.
Inside this upper citadel sat both the royal castle and the spectacular cathedral, two immense monuments of Norman engineering that faced each other across a narrow cobblestone plaza, forming a complex that was practically impregnable to traditional medieval siege tactics. The defense of this vital fortress by Nicola de la Haye remains one of the most compelling and underappreciated stories of female military leadership in the medieval era. Nicola had been appointed as Sheriff of Lincolnshire by King John himself, a rare honor for a woman at the time, and she had spent years managing the complex administration and defenses of the county. During the long months of the French siege, she had lived inside the castle under constant threat of starvation and bombardment, coordinating the defense of the narrow curtain walls and managing the dwindling supplies with a calm, businesslike efficiency that won the deep respect of her garrison and the terror of her enemies. The tactical details of the Battle of Lincoln fare a masterclass in urban warfare, a chaotic and bloody form of combat that medieval knights generally sought to avoid at all costs. The narrow, twisting lanes of the upper town, bounded by steep stone walls and timber-framed houses, prevented the French cavalry from utilizing their traditional tactical advantage, the massed, devastating lance charge in open fields. Instead, the fighting dissolved into dozens of isolated, furious melees at street corners and in small market squares, where horses were quickly hamstrung and knights were forced to fight on foot with broadswords, battle-axes, and heavy maces in a desperate struggle where no quarter was given. The death of the Count of Perche during the height of the battle square was the psychological turning point of the entire campaign. Perche, a relative of the French royal family, was a young man of immense pride and arrogance who had openly mocked the elderly William Marshal before the battle, calling him a spent force and a dotard. When his horse was killed beneath him and he found himself backed against the monumental stone portal of the cathedral, surrounded by a ring of determined English knights, his refusal to surrender was seen not as an act of bravery, but a foolish, tragic adherence to an outdated code of chivalry that had no place in the grim, practical reality of a civil war. The subsequent sack of the city of Lincoln by the victorious Royalist army was a dark and brutal postscript to Marshal's great victory. Although the town's merchants had been forced to support the French occupation, Marshal's soldiers treated the city as a den of traitors, launching into a systematic 3-day campaign of plunder, rape, and destruction that left the prosperous town completely devastated. Even the magnificent cathedral was not spared. Soldiers burst through the heavy wooden doors, smashing shrines, melting down gold candlesticks, and looting the vestry of its precious liturgical vestments, justifying their actions by claiming that the clergy of the city had aligned themselves with an excommunicated enemy prince. While the land campaign was decided in the blood-soaked streets of Lincoln, the naval victory at Sandwich was equally critical in securing the independence of the English kingdom. Medieval naval warfare was an exceptionally rare and terrifying occurrence, as ships of the period were not purpose-built warships, but rather standard merchant vessels known as cogs, which were hastily fitted with temporary wooden fighting platforms called castles at the bow and stern. These battles were essentially infantry engagements fought on water, where the primary objective was to grapple and board the enemy vessels, turning the unstable, slippery wooden decks into floating butcher shops. The use of quicklime as a chemical weapon at the Battle of Sandwich demonstrated a sophisticated and ruthless understanding of naval tactics that shocked contemporary observers. The powder, created by burning limestone in specialized kilns, was highly reactive. When it came into contact with water, such as the moisture in a man's eyes or sweat on his face, it produced an intense exothermic reaction that literally burned the tissue, causing immediate, excruciating pain and permanent blindness. The French knights, locked inside their heavy iron helmets, found themselves breathing in the burning white dust as it drifted across their decks, rendering them utterly helpless as the English boarding parties jumped across the gunwales with their axes raised. The execution of Eustace the monk on the deck of his own flagship was a moment of immense symbolic and political significance for the English people. Eustace had long been a figure of mythic terror along the southern coast of England, a man whispered to have made a pact with the devil that allowed him to make his ships invisible or to walk upon the water. By publicly beheading him and placing his severed head on a long lance, which was then carried in triumph through the streets of Canterbury, the royalist government systematically demolished the aura of supernatural invincibility that had surrounded the pirate, proving to the common people that God had indeed spoken in favor of the young King Henry. The financial settlement that finally bought Prince Louis out of England, the 10,000 marks agreed upon at the Treaty of Lambeth, was an immense sum that required the royal treasury to levy a special tax across the entire country. It was a bitter pill for the English people to swallow, effectively paying their invader to leave. But William Marshal recognized that it was a cheap price to pay for total peace and the preservation of the dynasty. Louis used the money to fund his subsequent military campaigns in France, but his dream of creating a unified Anglo-French empire under Capetian rule was shattered forever, ensuring that England and France would develop as distinct, rival nation-states throughout the remainder of the Middle Ages.
The long-term legacy of Magna Carta, reissued and solidified during the minority of Henry III, would eventually expand far beyond the wildest imaginations of the 13th century barons who drafted it. Originally intended as a highly specific, conservative document designed to protect the feudal privileges of a small noble elite from the overreach of a predatory king, the charter contained phrases that possessed an accidental, universal genius. The famous Clause 39, stating that no free man could be seized, imprisoned, or stripped of his rights except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, became the golden thread that would eventually weave its way into the concept of due process and universal human rights. As Henry III grew into adulthood, he spent immense sums of money attempting to rebuild the physical and spiritual prestige of the English monarchy, which had been so severely damaged by his father's disastrous reign. His greatest architectural project was the total rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, which he transformed into a magnificent Gothic masterpiece designed specifically to serve as a worthy burial place for English kings and a shrine for St. Edward the Confessor. Yet, despite his artistic sensibilities and his devotion to the church, Henry inherited his father's inability to manage his barons effectively, leading to a second great constitutional rebellion later in his reign, led by his own brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort. The memory of the lost treasure of the Wash remained a constant, tantalizing undercurrent throughout Henry's 56-year reign.
The king sent several official inquiries to the sheriffs of Lincolnshire, demanding reports on any unusual finds or attempts by local peasants to excavate the marshlands, but nothing was ever discovered. The deep silt of the estuary had acted as a perfect oxygen-free tomb, preserving the ancient wood of the wagons and the ironwork of the chests, but locking them away behind an impenetrable barrier of wet mud and shifting water channels that defied every primitive engineering technique of the era. The geographical transformation of the Wash over the centuries is a testament to the immense power of human engineering and environmental change. In the medieval period, the estuary was a vast, wild delta that extended miles inland, a region where the waters of 4 great midland rivers met the fierce currents of the North Sea, creating a constantly shifting wilderness of salt marshes and tidal pools. Beginning in the 17th century, a succession of wealthy landowners hired expert engineers from the Netherlands who utilized a complex system of dikes, sluices, and drainage canals to systematically push back the sea, transforming the treacherous quicksands into some of the most flat, fertile, and productive agricultural land in Western Europe. Today, if one drives along the straight, lonely roads of the Lincolnshire Fens, past the historic church towers and the isolated brick farmhouses, it is nearly impossible to imagine that this prosperous agricultural landscape was once a terrifying marine wilderness where an army drowned and a crown was lost. The fields of deep, dark loam hide their secrets well. The treasure of King John lies buried somewhere beneath the roots of the crops, a silent, multi-million-dollar museum of medieval history that remains entirely untouched by human hands since that fateful October afternoon in 1216. The story of the lost treasure and the civil war that surrounded it serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly the course of human history can pivot on a single reckless decision or an unpredictable twist of nature. Had King John chosen the longer, safer overland road around the Wash, his treasury would have remained intact, his mercenary army would have been paid, and the subsequent political compromise managed by William Marshal might have taken a radically different form. Instead, the disaster on the mudflats stripped the monarchy of its financial independence, forcing the crown into a position of permanent dependence on the political consent of its subjects, a shift that laid the very foundations of the modern representative state. The historical chroniclers who recorded these events, monks like Matthew Paris of St. Albans, Roger of Wendover, and the anonymous author of the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, were not detached, objective observers, but men deeply involved in the ideological struggles of their age. Writing in the quiet scriptoriums of their monasteries, dipping their quill pens into ink made of oak galls and iron filings, they wove their accounts with a mix of vivid journalistic detail and heavy theological moralizing, viewing the dramatic rise and fall of kings not merely as political history, but an ongoing cosmic drama where the hand of God was constantly visible in the affairs of men.
The death of William Marshal in 1219 marked the true end of an era, the passing of the last great Titan of the Norman world. As the old knight lay dying at his estate in Caversham, surrounded by his weeping children and his devoted wife, Isabel de Clare, he requested that his body be clothed in the simple white habit of the Knights Templar, an order he had joined years before during a crusade to the Holy Land. He was carried in a solemn procession to London and buried in the circular nave of the Temple Church, where his weathered stone effigy still lies today, its hands clasped in eternal prayer, a silent monument to the man who had held a fracturing nation together through the sheer force of his honor and his sword.
The tomb of King John, located in the choir of Worcester Cathedral, presents a fascinating and deeply ironic visual contrast to his reputation. The king had requested to be buried between the shrines of St. Oswald and St. Wulfstan, hoping that the proximity of these holy men would protect his troubled soul from the demonic torments he was certain awaited him in the afterlife. His magnificent stone effigy, carved from gray Purbeck marble shortly after his death, depicts him in full royal robes, his right hand resting on the pommel of his sword, and his head adorned with a grand, stylized crown, a perfect idealized representation of royal majesty that completely belies the reality of a king who died crownless, bankrupt, and broken in a lonely fortress. The geographical area where the baggage train met its destruction remains one of the most evocative and lonely landscapes in England. Known today as the marshy borderland between Lincolnshire and Norfolk, it is a region dominated by immense open skies, where the wind from the North Sea blows constantly over the flat dikes, and where the cries of thousands of migrating waterfowl create a haunting wilderness soundtrack. Standing on the edge of the old sea walls at twilight, looking out over the endless miles of dark soil that were once treacherous mudflats, one can still feel the weight of that distant 13th century tragedy, a moment when the wealth of a kingdom was swallowed by the earth in a matter of hours. The ongoing fascination with the King John's lost treasure is a reflection of a deeper, universal human desire to connect with the physical remnants of the past. It is not merely the material value of the gold and jewels that drives the imagination, but the realization that these objects were once held by the hands of the men and women who shaped the destiny of the English-speaking world. The lost crown of William the Conqueror, the silver pennies minted to pay mercenary knights, the secret letters written by royal clerks, all of them remain locked in the dark, cold embrace of the Lincolnshire silt, an inaccessible, perfect time capsule of an age of iron, faith, and revolution. As the medieval era drew to a close and the Tudor dynasty ascended the throne in the late 15th century, the story of King John underwent a fascinating political rehabilitation. Rather than being remembered solely as a cruel tyrant or a weak ruler who lost his empire, Tudor historians and playwrights, including William Shakespeare himself, reimagined John as an early Protestant hero who had courageously defied the political overreach of the Pope and the military aggression of the French king. In Shakespeare's historical play, King John, the disaster at the Wash is dramatized with intense, poetic tragedy, with the king receiving the news of his army's destruction while racked with fever, a scene that perfectly captured the crushing emotional weight of the historical reality. Yet beyond the theatrical reinventions and the legends of treasure hunters, the true significance of the events of 1216 lies in their profound, lasting impact on the development of human liberty. The civil war that broke out over Magna Carta was a brutal, destructive conflict that brought England to the very edge of total collapse, but it was also the painful birth canal through which the principle of the rule of law was dragged into the light. By forcing a tyrant king to accept that his power was subject to the law of the land, and by successfully defending that principle on the battlefields of Lincoln and the waters of Sandwich, the ordinary men and women of 13th century England ensured that the flame of liberty would never be entirely extinguished. The physical reality of the treasure's burial site means that any modern attempt to recover it would require an industrial engineering operation of staggering proportions. The silt layer that accumulated over the old estuary bed over the last 800 years is exceptionally thick, in some places exceeding 30 feet of compacted clay and wet sand. Because the groundwater table in the fens remains remarkably high, any excavation trench would instantly fill with liquid mud, requiring a continuous network of heavy-duty pumping stations and steel sheet piling to stabilize the earth, an operation that would devastate the highly productive agricultural fields that cover the region and cost far more than the material value of the silver and gold itself.
Thus, the treasure remains exactly where history left it, a golden ghost sleeping beneath the soil of England. It stands as a silent witness to a time when a king's greed and a nation's fury collided in a landscape of mud and water, leaving a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of justice, power, and human rights to this day. The Wash may have swallowed the physical wealth of the Plantagenet monarchy, but it could not destroy the ideas that emerged from that terrible conflict, ideas that would cross oceans and centuries, eventually becoming the legal birthright of millions of people who have never heard the name of King John or stood upon the lonely marshes of Lincolnshire. The ultimate tragedy of King John's life was that he was a man trapped by his own brilliant but destructive nature. He was incapable of understanding that true authority is not derived from fear, manipulation, or arbitrary exercise of absolute power, but from the mutual trust and consent that binds a ruler to his people. His desperate attempt to save his crown by risking his treasury across the sands of the Wash was the final perfect metaphor for his entire reign, a reckless, short-sighted gamble that ignored the immutable laws of nature and justice, resulting in an absolute, irrecoverable disaster that left him exposed to his enemies and condemned by history. In the final analysis, the story of the First Barons' War and the lost treasure of the Wash is not merely an entertaining chronicle of medieval warfare and political intrigue, but a profound human drama about the cost of tyranny and the resilience of a community determined to protect its rights. The names of John, Louis, William Marshal, and Nicola de la Haye are etched deep into the fabric of English history, their actions during those dark, tempestuous months of 1216 and 1217 serving as a perpetual reminder that no ruler, no matter how powerful or divinely sanctioned, is ever truly above the law of the land, and that the ultimate treasure of a nation is not the gold in its vaults, but the justice in its courts. As the sun sets over the quiet, flat horizons of modern Lincolnshire, casting long, dark shadows across the ancient drainage canals and the wide, open fields of modern Lincolnshire, one can almost hear the faint, echoing rumble of the wooden wagons and the distant shouts of the baggage drivers being swallowed by the rising tide so many centuries ago. The wind continues to blow off the North Sea, whistling through the stone battlements of the surviving castles and the high towers of the cathedrals, carrying with it the eternal, unyielding story of a nation that lost its crown but found its liberty in the deep, shifting sands of the Wash. The great narrative of England's survival in the early 12th century closes not with a grand royal pageant or a declaration of absolute victory, but with the quiet, routine administrative work of the reconstructed government. In the months following the departure of Prince Louis, the royal clerks of Henry III sat in their stone offices, their fingers stained with dark ink, carefully cataloguing the remaining assets of the realm and systematically re-establishing the standard judicial circuits across the counties. It was a tedious, unglamorous process, but it was the true foundation of the nation's recovery, a quiet reassertion of institutional stability and legal regularity after years of catastrophic civil war and foreign invasion.
The young king himself, growing up under the protective guardianship of loyal nobles like Hubert of Berg, was constantly reminded of the heavy cost of his father's misrule. He was taught to revere the memory of William Marshal and to view Magna Carta not as a humiliating shackle on his royal prerogative, but as a sacred covenant that ensured the peace and prosperity of his kingdom. Though Henry's own long reign would be marked by numerous political crises and conflicts, the basic constitutional framework established during his turbulent minority remained unbroken, providing a stable legal anchor that prevented the English state from ever slipping back into the absolute, lawless tyranny of the past. And so, the lost treasure of King John remains precisely where the forces of nature and history conspired to place it, deep within the silent, oxygen-free dark clay of the Lincolnshire fens, an eternal monument to a moment of supreme historical crisis. The golden crowns, the silver coins, and the sacred relics are gone from the sight of man, but the ideas that were born out of that terrible conflict continue to illuminate the world, their value far exceeding any wealth that could ever be excavated from the mud. The story of the crown lost in the wash remains one of the greatest legends of the medieval world, a perfect, glittering parable about the limits of earthly power and the enduring majesty of human freedom.
The loss of the royal wardrobe and the subsequent death of King John did not merely create a vacuum at the head of the English state, it fundamentally fractured the administrative machinery that had bound the Anglo-Norman Empire together for over a century. To understand the sheer scale of the administrative paralysis that followed, one must look at how the medieval English government actually functioned on a daily basis. The treasury was not a static vault located securely within the stone walls of the Tower of London or Westminster. It was an itinerating organ of state power, a massive mobile clearinghouse known as the wardrobe that traveled constantly with the king's person. Every writ issued by the royal clerks, every payment made to continental mercenaries, every diplomatic gift sent to foreign potentates, and every tax record detailing the debts of the baronial families had to be physically transported in leather-bound chests across the rutted roads of the realm. When the incoming tide of the wash swallowed those wagons, it did not just drown horses and bury gold, it effectively erased the bureaucratic memory of the kingdom. The immediate consequence of this administrative obliteration was a complete breakdown in the Crown's ability to wage conventional warfare. For months, King John had relied on a vast network of foreign mercenaries, Brabantines, Flemings, and Poitevins, who had no inherent loyalty to the Plantagenet cause and were driven entirely by the regular distribution of silver pennies. With the royal chests entombed beneath the Lincolnshire silt, the incoming regent, William Marshal, found himself in the mathematically impossible position of defending a fracturing kingdom with a completely empty ledger. The mercenary captains, sensing that the fountain of royal silver had permanently dried up, began to look to their own survival, either deserting the royalist cause entirely or seizing local manors and monastic lands to hold as personal collateral against the wages they were owed. This fiscal catastrophe forced William Marshal into an unprecedented reliance on the constitutional machinery he had spent his life treating with deep aristocratic skepticism. The reissuing of Magna Carta in November 1216 was not a grand idealistic statement of human rights, but a desperate, cold-blooded act of political bankruptcy. Because the Crown could no longer afford to buy an army, it had no choice but to purchase the political consent of its subjects by surrendering the arbitrary financial prerogatives that had defined the Norman monarchy since the conquest.
The Great Charter, which John had spent the last year of his life trying to systematically dismantle with the blessing of the Pope, suddenly became the only legal anchor left to keep the young Henry III on the throne, transformed by the pragmatism of the regent into the foundational bedrock of royal legitimacy. Meanwhile, Prince Louis and his French forces in London were facing their own logistical and psychological crisis. The landing of a foreign prince on English soil had initially been welcomed by an aristocracy pushed to the brink of madness by John's tyranny, but as the weeks stretched into months, the reality of a French occupation began to sour the baronial enthusiasm. Louis, naturally favoring the Capetian knights and advisers who had crossed the Channel with him, began to systematically grant captured English castles and estates to his continental commanders, ignoring the claims of the very English nobles who had invited him to take the crown. The death of the old king completely removed the primary emotional catalyst for the rebellion. The barons were no longer fighting for their survival against a vengeful tyrant, but were instead complicit in the systematic dismemberment of their own native kingdom by a foreign dynasty. The tactical significance of Nicola de la Haye's defense of Lincoln Castle during this critical juncture cannot be overstated. Had Lincoln fallen to the joint French and rebel forces before William Marshal could assemble his relief army, Prince Louis would have secured an unbroken line of communication and control stretching from the ports of London and Kent all the way to the baronial strongholds in Yorkshire and Northumberland. The city of Lincoln, perched majestically upon its limestone ridge, acted as the vital linchpin of the entire kingdom's transport network, dominating the intersection of the ancient Roman Ermine Street and the Fossway. For months, Nicola's small, heavily rationed garrison held the castle walls against continuous bombardment by enemy Perriers and mangonels, turning the stone fortress into an unyielding island of royalist resistance in the middle of a rebel sea. When the elderly William Marshal finally arrived at the northern gates of Lincoln on the morning of May 20th, 1217, he knew that the entire future of the English-speaking world depended on the tactical outcome of the next few hours. The battle that followed was an extraordinary exhibition of medieval military professionalism, overcoming superior numbers through sheer geographical exploitation. By utilizing a hidden postern gate to introduce Fawkes de Breata's crossbowmen directly onto the high ramparts of the castle, Marshal managed to completely neutralize the defensive advantages of the city walls, turning the narrow, steep streets below into a vertical killing field where the massed French cavalry could neither charge nor retreat. The death of the proud young Count of Pesche in the Cathedral Close was the definitive exclamation point on a tactical masterpiece that shattered the land army of the French prince in a single afternoon. Yet, as spectacular as the victory at Lincoln was, it remained fundamentally incomplete so long as the English Channel remained open to French reinforcements. The subsequent naval engagement at Sandwich in August 1717 demonstrated a level of tactical innovation and military ruthlessness that permanently altered the nature of medieval maritime warfare. The English sailors, largely composed of the tough, independent mariners of the Cinque Ports, understood that they could not match the sheer size and weight of Blanche Casteel's great transport cogs in a traditional boarding action. By deliberately maneuvering to gain the weather gauge and utilizing quicklime as a chemical blinding agent, the English fleet turned the wind itself into a weapon of mass destruction, suffocating the French knights inside their own iron helmets and breaking the naval spine of the Capetian invasion.
The execution of Eustace the monk on the blood-slicked deck of his own flagship
was far more than an act of wartime vengeance. It was a calculated political demonstration designed to break the psychological hold of the invader over the common people of England. Eustace was a terrifying figure of the medieval imagination, a man whose transition from a Benedictine cloister to a life of high-seas piracy had been accompanied by persistent rumors of necromancy and sorcery. By dragging him from the hold, denying his massive offers of gold ransom, and publicly beheading him on the gunwale of his own flagship, the Royalist forces systematically demonstrated that the supernatural aura surrounding the French cause was an illusion. The display of his severed head on a lance throughout the towns of Kent acted as a powerful visual declaration that the rightful order of the realm had been restored under the banner of the young Henry III. The signing of the Treaty of Lambeth in September 1217 brought a definitive end to one of the most dangerous and transformative chapters in English history. Prince Louis, trapped in London without hope of continental reinforcement or domestic financial support, accepted a massive payout of 10,000 marks to renounce his claim to the English throne and sail back to France. It was a bitter, expensive peace for a bankrupt nation, requiring the imposition of a grueling nationwide tax to raise the necessary silver, but it secured the permanent independence of the English crown. The Plantagenet dynasty had survived its greatest existential threat, not through the military prowess of its monarch, but the unyielding honor of an elderly regent, the legendary tenacity of a female castellan, and the tactical brilliance of common sailors fighting with the wind and lime at their backs. The true legacy of this extraordinary conflict, however, lies buried far deeper than the treaties signed by princes or the tombs erected for knights. It lies in the permanent transformation of the English common law that occurred during the long 56-year reign of Henry III. The child king, raised in the long shadow of his father's catastrophe and the loss of the royal wardrobe, grew up with an acute awareness of the practical limits of his own authority. Every time he issued a new charter or sought to levy a tax on his subjects, he was forced to return to the principles established in the water meadows of Runnymede and validated on the battlefields of Lincoln. The Great Charter was no longer a temporary piece of political bartering. It had become an immutable, sacred contract between the ruler and the ruled, establishing a legal precedent that would eventually cross the Atlantic Ocean to shape the constitutional architecture of the modern democratic world.
The friction between the Stuart belief in absolute divine right and the English commitment to parliamentary supremacy escalated rapidly under James I's son, Charles I. Charles possessed none of his father's political pragmatism. He viewed any parliamentary questioning of his authority as an outright act of sedition. When the Parliament of 1628 refused to grant him lifelong customs revenues without a formal redress of grievances, Charles reluctantly signed the Petition of Right, a landmark constitutional document that reaffirmed the ancient prohibitions against arbitrary taxation, forced billeting of soldiers, and imprisonment without due process. However, Charles quickly reneged on the agreement, dissolving the legislature in 1629 and embarking on an 11-year period of personal rule, known to his critics as the 11 Years' Tyranny.
To fund his government without calling Parliament, the king resurrected archaic medieval fiscal expedients, most notoriously expanding ship money, a tax traditionally levied only on coastal towns during wartime for naval defense, into a permanent, nationwide peacetime assessment. The breaking point arrived in 1637, when Charles attempted to forcibly impose a new, highly ritualistic Anglican prayer book on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. This sparked a massive national rebellion north of the border, known as the Bishops' Wars. Outmaneuvered militarily and completely bankrupted by the campaign, Charles was forced to end his personal rule and summon the legislature in 1640. This assembly, which came to be known as the Long Parliament, immediately moved to dismantle the machinery of royal absolutism. Led by the brilliant and unyielding country squire John Pym, the Commons abolished the predatory royal prerogative courts, such as the Court of Star Chamber, declared ship money illegal, and passed the Triennial Act, which mandated that Parliament must be summoned at least once every 3 years, regardless of the king's wishes. As the political deadlock degenerated into the English Civil War in the autumn of 1642, the conflict quickly eclipsed the baronial wars of the Middle Ages in both its ideological intensity and its logistical scale. This was no longer a struggle between rival factions of the aristocracy. It was a total polarization of English society, pitting the royalist cavaliers, composed largely of the traditional nobility, rural gentry, and high church Anglicans, against the parliamentary Roundheads, which drew their strength from the wealthy merchant classes of London, the urban manufacturing towns, and the fiercely independent Puritan yeomanry. The military turning point of the war occurred in 1645 with the radical structural reorganization of the parliamentary forces into the new model army. Under the administrative genius of Sir Thomas Fairfax and the iron tactical discipline of Oliver Cromwell, this force became the first truly professional national army in English history. Unlike traditional feudal levies or regional militias, promotions within the new model army were based entirely on military merit and ideological commitment rather than aristocratic birth. Fed by regular, state-directed assessments and armed with standard-issue equipment, Cromwell's iron-disciplined cavalry, the Ironsides, shattered the royalist forces at the decisive battles of Naseby and Langport, permanently breaking the king's military capacity to wage war. The total military victory of the army, however, unleashed a wave of radical political and religious speculation that terrified the conservative elements within Parliament. In the autumn of 1647, representatives of the common soldiers and radical London political thinkers known as the Levellers gathered at a parish church in South London for the historic Putney debates. There, ordinary citizens argued for a comprehensive overhaul of the English Constitution, drafting a text called the Agreement of the People. This astonishing document went far beyond anything previously imagined, demanding universal male suffrage, the total abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords, complete freedom of religion, and equality for all citizens before the law. Though Cromwell and the senior army grandees ruthlessly suppressed the Leveller movement to prevent total social anarchy,
The ideological genies of popular sovereignty and natural human rights had been permanently let out of the bottle. Finding Charles I to be an incorrigible negotiator who had secretly invited a Scottish army to invade England to restore him to power, the leadership of the new model army took the ultimate revolutionary step. In December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride carried out a military purge of the Long Parliament, forcibly excluding any member who favored continued negotiations with the king. The remaining Rump Parliament, comprising roughly 80 radical members, established a High Court of Justice to put the monarch on trial for high treason against his own people. On January 30, 1649, Charles I was walked out onto a wooden scaffold erected outside the banqueting house at Whitehall Palace and publicly beheaded. It was an earth-shattering event that permanently broke the sacred mystique of European absolute monarchy. The executioners did not merely kill a man, they destroyed an entire political theology, demonstrating to a stunned world that an anointed king was not above the law, but was merely a public official answerable to the sovereign community of the nation.
The execution of Charles I plunged England into an unprecedented 11-year political experiment known as the Interregnum, during which the nation was formally declared a commonwealth and free state. With the monarchy and the House of Lords completely abolished by statutory decree, the remaining members of the Rump Parliament attempted to govern through a centralized Council of State. However, this civilian regime quickly proved incapable of managing the compounding crises of a fractured empire. Across the Irish Sea, Royalist confederacies and Catholic forces held the majority of the countryside, while in Scotland, the late king's eldest son was proclaimed King Edward's successor as Charles II, directly threatening the security of the young English Republic. Fearing a counter-revolutionary invasion, the Council of State dispatched Oliver Cromwell and the veteran regiments of the new model army to pacify the outer rims of the British Isles. The campaigns that followed were characterized by a relentless industrial efficiency that permanently altered the geopolitical landscape. In Ireland, Cromwell's forces utilized heavy siege artillery and iron discipline to crush the Royalist Catholic alliance, conducting brutal pacifications at Drogheda and Wexford that broke the back of armed resistance and initiated a massive systematic confiscation of Irish lands to pay off English war creditors. Turning north to Scotland, Cromwell achieved brilliant tactical victories over superior numbers at Dunbar in 1550 and Worcester in 1551. These campaigns effectively dissolved the ancient national borders, forcibly incorporating Ireland and Scotland into a unified, English-dominated Republican Commonwealth governed directly from Westminster. Despite these stunning military triumphs abroad, the domestic political settlement remained fundamentally unstable. The Rump Parliament, increasingly corrupt and desperately clinging to power, refused to dissolve itself or enact the sweeping legal reforms demanded by the common soldiers. Losing all patience with the civilian politicians, Cromwell took an elite detachment of musketeers to the Parliament House on April 20, 1653, and forcibly ejected the members, famously shouting, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. In the name of God, go."
With the civilian administration entirely shattered, the army leadership attempted to draft a new constitutional architecture for the state. In December 1653, they ratified the Instrument of Government, the first and only written constitution in English history. This text concentrated executive authority in a singular supreme magistrate, appointing Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector for life. The Protectorate, however, quickly degenerated into a highly unpopular military dictatorship. Faced with persistent royalist conspiracies and radical religious uprisings like Fifth Monarchists, Cromwell divided the kingdom into 11 administrative regions, placing each under the absolute command of a major general. These military governors enforced a strict puritanical social code, closing theaters, banning horse racing, and systematically suppressing traditional Christmas celebrations, which deeply alienated the common people and fostered a profound, long-lasting national aversion to the maintenance of a standing army during peacetime.
When Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658, his fragile constitutional creation collapsed almost overnight. His well-meaning but politically incompetent son, Richard Cromwell, inherited the office of Lord Protector, but completely lacked the respect of the army grandees. Within months, the senior generals forced Richard to resign, throwing the nation into a chaotic vortex of competing military factions and shifting parliamentary remnants that threatened to trigger a third civil war. The political deadlock was broken by General George Monk, the commander of the English garrison in Scotland. Recognizing that the only alternative to total military anarchy was the restoration of the traditional legal order, Monk marched his disciplined army south to London in early 1660. He recalled the original members of the Long Parliament who had been excluded by Pride's Purge over a decade prior, ordering them to dissolve themselves and arrange for a newly elected convention parliament. This fresh assembly immediately sent an embassy to the exiled Charles II, who was waiting across the Channel in Flanders. In April 1660, the prince issued the Declaration of Breda, a masterly political document that promised a general pardon for wartime actions, a guarantee of religious tolerance, and a commitment to respect property rights, subject to the final approval of Parliament. On May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles II rode into London amidst a sea of cheering crowds, waving banners, and pealing church bells. The monarchy was restored without the firing of a single shot, but it was fundamentally altered from the absolute institution his father had known. The divine right of kings was buried on the scaffold of Whitehall. The restored crown was now a permanent passenger within a complex, balanced constitutional framework that remained irrevocably anchored to the sovereign authority of the common law and the supreme legislative will of Parliament. The prospect of a Catholic monarch sitting at the head of the English state ignited a mass political hysteria across the nation, fueled by the manufactured fabrication of the popish plot by Titus Oates. In response, parliamentary opposition crystallized under the brilliant, ruthless leadership of Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury and his followers, who came to be known as the Whigs, introduced a series of exclusion bills designed to legally alter the succession and bar James from inheriting the crown. To counter this existential threat to the hereditary monarchy, the king's defenders, dubbed the Tories, argued passionately that the crown was an unalterable divine inheritance that could not be manipulated by a legislative vote without plunging the country back into the anarchy of the 1210s or 1640s. This bitter ideological struggle marked the definitive historic birth of the two-party political system in the English-speaking world. Charles II managed to break the Whig opposition by skillfully dissolving successive parliaments and utilizing secret, massive financial subsidies from King Louis XIV of France to govern without summoning the legislature during the final 4 years of his life. When he died peacefully in February 1885, his brother ascended the throne smoothly as James II. However, James possessed none of Charles's tactical agility. He was an ideological dogmatist who mistook the Tory defense of the hereditary succession for an endorsement of absolute royal authority. Within months of his accession, James faced a major armed uprising led by Charles II's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth. The Monmouth Rebellion was swiftly and ruthlessly crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor, the last major pitched battle fought on English soil. In the aftermath, James utilized the security crisis to systematically expand the peacetime standing army to 30,000 men, appointing Catholic officers to key commands in direct defiance of the Test Acts. When Parliament protested, the king summarily prorogued the assembly, embarking on a disastrous campaign to pack the local courts and borough corporations with loyalists who would authorize his absolute prerogative to suspend the laws of the land by royal decree. The definitive breaking point arrived in the summer of 1688. In June, James's Italian queen, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy son, James Francis Edward Stuart. This completely transformed the political calculus. The Protestant nation could no longer comfort itself with the expectation that the Catholic king would be succeeded by his devoutly Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. The prospect of a permanent, self-perpetuating Catholic dynasty on the English throne unified the Whig and Tory leadership in a state of shared desperation. On June 30, 1688, an elite cabal of 7 prominent politicians, later dubbed the Immortal Seven, dispatched a clandestine, coded letter to the Protestant ruler of the Dutch Republic, William of Orange, who was married to James's eldest daughter, Mary. They invited William to cross the sea with an army to restore the traditional liberties of the realm and investigate the legitimacy of the newborn prince. William, deep in an existential geopolitical struggle against Louis XIV's expansionist France, recognized that bringing England's vast financial and naval resources into the anti-French coalition was worth the massive gamble of an overseas invasion. On November 5, 1688, carried by a remarkable Protestant wind that kept James's fleet pinned down in the Thames, William's massive armada landed safely at Tor Bay in Devonshire. As the Dutch army advanced towards London, James II's regime dissolved into a farce of desertions and administrative panic.
His commanders, including the brilliant young John Churchill, walked over to the invaders' camp.
Realizing he was utterly isolated, James panicked, cast the Great Seal of the realm into the muddy depths of the River Thames to paralyze the administration, and fled across the Channel to the protection of the French court. The Glorious Revolution was not a triumph of radical republicanism, but the definitive conservative codification of the historic English constitutional tradition. Meeting in February 1689, a newly convened Convention Parliament declared that James II had effectively abdicated the throne by fleeing the realm and breaking his contract with the people. The Assembly offered the vacant crown to William and Mary as joint sovereigns, but this historic offer was strictly conditional upon their explicit, formal acceptance of the Declaration of Rights. Turned into statutory law as the Bill of Rights in late 1689, this monumental text permanently anchored the constitutional architecture of the modern world. It swept away the royal pretension to suspend laws, rendered peacetime standing armies illegal without legislative approval, guaranteed free parliamentary elections, and established absolute freedom of speech within the chambers of Westminster. The long 4.5-century journey that had begun with the loss of the royal wardrobe in the Lincolnshire mud had reached its ultimate destination. The concept of absolute monarchy was permanently dead in the English-speaking world, replaced by the unshakable supremacy of the king in Parliament and the rule of law. The constitutional settlement of 1689 did more than just anchor the domestic liberties of the realm. It completely rewired the global financial architecture. By binding the crown to the permanent oversight of Parliament, the Glorious Revolution solved a fundamental economic problem that had plagued English monarchs since the Middle Ages: sovereign creditworthiness. When King John lost his treasure chests in the Wash, or when Charles I arbitrarily seized the gold bullion stored by London merchants in the Tower Mint in 1640, they demonstrated that an absolute ruler could never be a trusted borrower. Because the steward kings could systematically default on their debts or manipulate the currency at whim, international financiers charged them astronomical interest rates, severely limiting England's capacity to fund long-term global conflicts. The Bill of Rights inverted this dynamic by creating the concept of the national debt. Loans were no longer made to the person of the monarch, but to the institution of Parliament, which guaranteed repayment through its exclusive statutory control over the national tax base. Because investors knew a representative parliament was highly unlikely to vote to default on its own bonds, the risk premium plummeted. To systematically manage this new, highly sophisticated system of public credit, Parliament chartered the Bank of England in 1694. This institutional breakthrough allowed the state to raise unprecedented millions of pounds in paper currency at rock-bottom interest rates, creating a financial engine that could effortlessly outfund the absolute, cash-starved monarchy of Bourbon France in the global conflicts that lay ahead. This financial revolution was accompanied by a critical structural adjustment to the inner workings of the executive branch, the birth of the cabinet system. King William III, and later his successor, Queen Anne, quickly discovered that managing an increasingly complex two-party parliament required a permanent inner council of ministers who could command a reliable voting majority in the House of Commons. When the Hanoverian dynasty ascended the throne in the person of King George I, a German prince who spoke no English and possessed little interest in the tedious day-to-day administration of British domestic policy, the center of gravity shifted definitively. Executive power was consolidated in the hands of a singular minister who chaired the cabinet meetings, managed the distribution of royal patronage, and acted as the vital intermediary between the Crown and the legislature, the Prime Minister. Sir Robert Walpole, serving from 1721 to 1742, became the historic architect of this modern executive role, demonstrating that a prime minister's ultimate survival depended not on the personal favor of the king, but on maintaining absolute discipline and an unbroken working majority within the House of Commons. As the 18th and 19th centuries unfolded, the imperial state that evolved from this constitutional matrix expanded across the globe, carrying the structural templates of Westminster and the common law to every corner of the planet. Yet the internal architecture of the British system remained dynamic, driven by a continuous, peaceful pressure to democratize its own representative structures. The Great Reform Act of 1832 systematically swept away the archaic medieval rotten boroughs, depopulated rural hamlets that still returned 2 members to Parliament, while industrial powerhouses like Manchester and Birmingham had no representation, permanently shifting political dominance to the expanding urban middle class. Subsequent Reform Acts in 1867 and 1884 progressively extended the franchise to the working classes, transforming Parliament from an aristocratic talking shop into a genuinely representative, mass democratic assembly. Today, the physical landscape of the Lincolnshire Wash bears little resemblance to the treacherous, untamed delta that swallowed the medieval vanguard of King John. Centuries of systematic, state-directed drainage, agricultural reclamation, and the construction of massive modern sluice complexes have transformed the shifting sands and brackish fens into some of the most fertile, stable, arable farmland in Europe. Yet beneath the rich, dark soil of those quiet agricultural fields, the lost royal wardrobe continues to rest in its silent, oxygen-free tomb, a physical punctuation mark at the definitive end of an old world. The gold, silver, and ancient relics that sank into the mud were the material expressions of an absolute, unconstrained monarchy that believed its will was the ultimate law of the land. When the tide claimed those treasures, it cleared the stage for an entirely different national trajectory. The ideas that arose from that cataclysm, written charters, institutional accountability, a professional civil bureaucracy, and the unshakable supremacy of representative governance, outlasted the dynastic empires of Europe, establishing the foundational legal architecture that continues to define and protect human liberty across the modern world.
The transformation of the Westminster model into a global template for governance reached its ultimate structural test during the mid-20th century as the British Empire systematically decolonized. This era witnessed the rapid legislative export of the King in Parliament architecture to dozens of newly independent nations across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Known structurally as the Westminster Export Model, this constitutional package was not merely a set of written rules, but an entire institutional ecosystem. It required a strict, bifurcated executive consisting of a ceremonial head of state, either a governor-general representing the crown or a non-executive president, and a politically potent head of government, the prime minister, who was drawn directly from and remained strictly accountable to a democratically elected legislature. The transplantation of these deep-seated traditions, which had taken over 7 centuries to slowly mature in the highly specific cultural and legal soil of England, produced widely divergent results. In nations like India, the model demonstrated an extraordinary resilient adaptability. The Indian Constitution of 1950 seamlessly merged the core mechanics of Westminster executive accountability with a federalist structure, creating the world's largest functioning democracy. Conversely, in other post-colonial arenas, the lack of an established, culturally embedded tradition of a loyal opposition caused the system to fracture. Without the unwritten norms of institutional restraint and mutual toleration that had prevented British political warfare from turning lethal since 1688, the winner-take-all nature of the first-past-the-post electoral system occasionally exacerbated regional and ethnic divisions, leading to rapid transitions into presidential autocracies or military regimes. Concurrently, within the United Kingdom itself, the late 20th and early 21st centuries brought about a radical internal restructuring of the state through the mechanism of devolution. For nearly 300 years following the Acts of Union in 1707 and 1801, the doctrine of absolute parliamentary sovereignty meant that a single, centralized legislature at Westminster held exclusive authority to make laws for the entire United Kingdom. However, growing nationalist sentiment in the historic nations of the Union forced a profound constitutional reassessment.
Through the passage of the Scotland Act, the Government of Wales Act, and the Northern Ireland Act in 1998, the Westminster Parliament voluntarily surrendered its monopoly on domestic policy. It created a devolved Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, a National Assembly for Wales in Cardiff, and a power-sharing assembly at Stormont in Belfast. This fundamentally transformed the UK from a unitary state into a complex quasi-federal partnership. While Westminster retained absolute control over reserved matters, such as foreign policy, defense, and macroeconomics, the devolved legislatures were granted sovereign authority over devolved matters, including health, education, and local justice. This internal constitutional rearrangement was further complicated by the UK's evolving relationship to transnational legal frameworks, most notably its 47-year membership in the European Union and its continued adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights. The introduction of the Human Rights Act in 1998 effectively incorporated the ECHR directly into domestic English law,
introducing a profound shift in the country's legal culture. For centuries, the judiciary had operated under the strict constraint of parliamentary supremacy. Judges could interpret laws passed by Westminster, but they possessed no constitutional authority to strike them down. Under the Human Rights Act, however, senior judges were empowered to issue formal declarations of incompatibility when domestic statutes violated fundamental human rights, forcing a structural dialogue between the courts and the executive that resembled the judicial review systems of continental Europe and North America. Today, as the modern world navigates an era of unprecedented digital acceleration, geopolitical realignment, and institutional volatility, the core principles born from the long line of English constitutional crises remain highly active. The underlying tension that defined the medieval battlefields of Lincoln, the execution scaffold at Whitehall, and the reform crises of Westminster, the perpetual struggle to balance executive efficiency with institutional accountability, legal regularity, and the consent of the governed, continues to serve as the defining challenge of modern democratic statecraft. The physical artifacts of the absolute Norman monarchy remain entombed beneath the rich, reclaimed agricultural topsoil of the Lincolnshire fens, completely inaccessible to the eye. Yet the invisible infrastructure that replaced them, the unshakable supremacy of the rule of law, the necessity of continuous representative consultation, and the absolute vulnerability of political power to the sovereign will of the people, survives as a resilient, living legacy, continuously shaping the evolution of human liberty across the globe.
The structural evolution of the Anglo-American legal tradition received its final modern crystallization through the systematic development of administrative law and the establishment of the modern regulatory state. Throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, the sheer velocity of industrialization, urbanization, and technological advancement presented a profound challenge to the traditional king in parliament model of governance.
Westminster could no longer cope with the hyper-technical realities of regulating railway networks, managing public health infrastructures, or stabilizing complex financial markets through traditional, slow-moving statutory legislation alone. Parliament was forced to adapt, transforming itself from a body that micromanaged national affairs into an elite macro-legislative engine that systematically delegated its authority to a vast array of specialized administrative agencies, boards, and commissions. This massive shift toward delegated legislation birthed the concept of the quongos, quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations and independent regulatory bodies in the United Kingdom, mirroring the expansion of the alphabet agencies across the Atlantic in the United States. To prevent this sprawling bureaucratic apparatus from degenerating into a modern iteration of the arbitrary, unconstrained executive power that King John had wielded, the common law courts engineered the modern doctrine of judicial review. Under this framework, senior judges do not evaluate whether an administrative decision is politically wise. Instead, they review whether the decision-maker acted within the strict legal boundaries established by Parliament, adhering to three foundational pillars: illegality, ensuring the agency did not misinterpret or exceed its statutory powers, ultra vires; irrationality, applying the Wednesbury unreasonableness test to confirm the decision was not so perverse that no sensible authority could have made it. Procedural impropriety, guaranteeing the principles of natural justice, such as the right to a fair hearing and the absence of bias, were meticulously observed. This sophisticated system of administrative accountability ensures that even in an era of hyper-complex state intervention, the fundamental premise of the English constitutional tradition remains unbroken. The executive, in all its various modern guises, is entirely subordinate to the sovereign will of the law. On a global scale, this unique constitutional blueprint continues to serve as an unshakable point of reference for international legal systems, anchoring the definition of what constitutes a free, stable, and just society. The long, messy, and frequently bloody journey that began in the autumn of 1216, when the incoming tide of the Wash swallowed the physical symbols of an absolute, arbitrary Norman monarchy, has reached its permanent destination. The lost gold, silver, and ancient regalia remain forever entombed in their cold, silent, oxygen-free sanctuary beneath the quiet, drained agricultural topsoil of Lincolnshire. Yet the invisible, indestructible architecture that rose from their muddy destruction, the unyielding supremacy of the rule of law, the absolute requirement of representative consultation, the clarity of due process, and the ultimate vulnerability of political power to the sovereign will of the people, survives as a resilient, living global legacy, continuously defining, protecting, and shaping the evolution of human liberty across the world.
The durability of the Westminster system in the 21st century is being tested not by massed knightly cavalry or royal mercenaries, but by the borderless, rapid realities of the digital age. The modern state operates in an information ecosystem that King John, Oliver Cromwell, or even the Victorian reformers could not have conceived. Cyber warfare, algorithmic governance, and automated disinformation campaigns have transformed the public sphere from a physical marketplace or a stone debating hall into a vast, decentralized web of instantaneous data flows. This technological shift has forced a profound reassessment of how a constitution built on slow-moving, deliberative compromise can defend its sovereignty and protect its citizens from invisible, fast-moving systemic threats. One of the most complex battlefields in this modern arena is the regulation of data privacy and artificial intelligence. Just as the baronial assemblies of the 13th century fought to secure individual property rights against arbitrary royal seizure, modern parliaments are tasked with securing the digital property and cognitive liberty of individual citizens, both against corporate monopolies and intrusive state surveillance. The passage of frameworks like the UK General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, and the ongoing debates over comprehensive artificial intelligence acts represent a new frontier of constitutional law. These statutes attempt to impose the traditional principles of the rule of law, transparency, accountability, and procedural fairness upon complex, proprietary machine learning models that increasingly dictate everything from state welfare distributions to criminal justice risk assessments. Furthermore, the rise of decentralized ledger technologies and cryptocurrencies has introduced a radical challenge to the state's monopoly over the creation and regulation of money,
a monopoly that was central to the financial revolution of 1694 and the establishment of the Bank of England. By operating outside the traditional centralized banking clearinghouses that parliaments can easily audit and tax, these digital currencies threaten to decouple the concept of wealth from national territory. Modern finance ministries are caught in a continuous cycle of regulatory catching up, attempting to devise legal frameworks that can track and tax these elusive assets without stifling technological innovation or driving economic activity into unregulatable darknets. Despite these unprecedented disruptions, the deep-seated cultural architecture of the common law tradition demonstrates an extraordinary, resilient capacity for survival. The fundamental mechanisms engineered through centuries of domestic crises, the unyielding requirement that the executive branch must justify its actions before an independent judiciary, the insularity of public administrators from political interference, and the ultimate dependency of all legislative power on the uncoerced vote of an ordinary citizen remain the most reliable safeguards against modern forms of technocratic authoritarianism.
The physical treasures that sank into the Lincolnshire mud over 800 years ago are long gone, dissolved into the chemical history of the fenlands, an enduring myth for antiquarians. Their loss remains the stark material boundary stone between a world of absolute personal tyranny and a world of collaborative, institutional statecraft. The living inheritance that took their place, the magnificent, evolving machinery of constitutional democracy, continues to adapt, adjust, and expand, remaining the foundational global matrix for the protection and preservation of human freedom. This ongoing digital evolution has sparked a profound transformation within Parliament itself, fundamentally altering how the legislature communicates with the electorate and scrutinizes the executive. For centuries, the House of Commons relied on physical proximity and tangible documentation, from the handwritten vellum of the medieval era to the meticulously printed volumes of the official Hansard record. Today, the Palace of Westminster operates as a hyper-connected digital hub. Parliamentary committees utilize data analytics to track government spending in real time, live stream committee hearings to global audiences, and deploy interactive online portals that allow ordinary citizens to directly petition for legislative changes, lowering the barrier to political participation to a level never before seen in human history. However, this systemic openness introduces a parallel vulnerability. The critical infrastructure of representative democracy is now a primary target for hostile cyber operations. Foreign state actors and sophisticated hacking collectives routinely launch distributed denial-of-service attacks, spear phishing campaigns, and ransomware incursions against parliamentary networks, aiming to corrupt legislative databases, leak confidential committee deliberations, or paralyze the voting mechanisms of the state. The defense of the realm is no longer fought solely on the open seas or at stone fortresses like Lincoln and Dover, but in the abstract, invisible architectures of the digital spectrum, requiring the state to maintain elite cadres of cybersecurity professionals within organizations like the National Cybersecurity Center, NCSC, to safeguard the digital integrity of the democratic process.
This shift from physical to digital warfare mirrors the deeper conceptual journey of the English-speaking world's legal architecture over the last 8 centuries. The transition from an itinerant, arbitrary monarchy to a stationary, rule-bound constitutional commonwealth was ultimately a victory of abstract institutional trust over brute personal force. When King John's heavy baggage wagon sank into the deep, suffocating mud of the Wash, the physical loss of the gold and the ancient Norman regalia forced the nation to construct a state that was built on ideas rather than possessions. The true treasure of the realm was revealed to be not the crown jewels or the contents of a royal chest, but the unwritten, evolving contract between the government and the governed.
As the constitutional matrix of the Westminster system faces the uncharted challenges of the 21st century, balancing the rapid, autonomous efficiency of artificial intelligence with the foundational human rights of individual citizens, the historical lessons of its long development remain entirely vital. The structural resilience of the common law tradition lies in its refusal to remain static. It adapts, absorbs, and self-corrects through every major crisis, ensuring that power remains permanently bound to the supremacy of the law. The secret things buried beneath the rich, drained agricultural fields of Lincolnshire will continue to sleep undisturbed in their silent, oxygen-free sanctuary, while the magnificent, living ideas that rose directly from their destruction continue to guide, govern, and protect the evolution of human liberty across the globe.